Did you got your soup and I got my I got your chocolate.
Did you?
Yes, and you got my.
I hope.
Yes, I did.
Good, because
Not all in one go, no, but
you're still.
yeah.
But I thought I would cut a little piece off it, eat it. And I did that a couple of times in Thailand. I thought, can't do that.
You could give that away
Don't hit
before you
us.
eat it all.
Well, exactly.
Don't hit us.
Much
With
better.
this.
Yeah.
It can get pretty.
Broken kitchen.
Is a violin bow shorter than that?
I'm going to talk all about that, actually.
Really?
Yeah. So, how many of you were able to attend the TSO concert last week? Great. At least we have one that was there. That's great. And so, the music that we performed last week was an all Baroque program. We played 2 pieces by Handel and then another piece by Vivaldi. And one of the things that I have always found very interesting about performing Baroque music is that it was written so long ago that the style of playing is sometimes a little bit different when we play them on our modern instruments. Now, the reason why the style is different is because in the Baroque period, on a stringed instrument anyway, and I won't get into all the other instruments because we'd be here a very long time. But on a stringed instrument, we did not have a chin rest during the Baroque period. We also were not in the practice of using shoulder rests in the Baroque period. The chin rest was invented in the early 1800s, and this was past the time of the Baroque period. So even violinists such as Paganini, who you've probably heard of before, he didn't use a chin rest. So that was one of the differences. Another difference is that I play on metal strings, and we
Do you?
oh yeah, these are titanium and they're wound with silver. Some other brands of strings are steel, perlon. There's all sorts of different metals that they use. In the Baroque period, they used sheep gut strings. And they actually called it cat gut, but it was not cat, it was sheep. Now, the differences in sound between those two types of strings, between playing on a gut string or a metal string, is that the gut strings were a lot softer. There wasn't a lot of volume that came out of them. Another difference is that their bows were a lot shorter. They were shaped a little bit differently. I actually do not own a Baroque bow like some of my colleagues do, but the tips were slanted a little bit more in, and they were, as you said earlier, a lot shorter. So that also, because of the lack of length, made them a little bit lighter as well, which means that you're playing on a string that is not as loud as our modern day strings, and on a bow that's much lighter, you're really not going to get as much volume out. Another performance practice in the Baroque period was that, I'm sure you've all seen string players do this. Does anybody know what that's called?
Probably fingering.
Nope. This is called vibrato,
Vibrato.
from the word vibrate, of course. So, and vibrating, they did not do this in the Baroque period at all. And if they did, it was very little and just a little tiny shimmer. Part of the reason why they didn't do that was because they were holding their instruments differently. They didn't have the support of the chin rest and the shoulder rest to be able to hold it up on their shoulder without their hand. So much of the support was coming from their hand to keep the instrument up, which means that that little shimmer wasn't as easy to do. For me, I have all the supports, right? So I can just create all this space and I can flop around as much as I want to. The other, yeah, those are mostly the main differences between our instruments then and our instruments now. Now let's get to our modern day practice of performing Baroque music. So in the modern times now, as we approached our rehearsals with Kevin and going into this concert, he said, okay, I don't want it completely stylistically in the Baroque period, but I want it lighter, and you don't have to choke up on your bow. This is what we call, sometimes in modern times now, we choke up on the bow to emulate or simulate a shorter bow. So as I'm bowing, I'm only going to use that much bow instead of. It changes the sound quite a bit. So those are the main differences. I just wanted to kind of point that out. And I'm also going to play for you one of the movements from one of the Bach cello suites that I know this isn't a cello, this is my viola. And these are suites that Bach wrote. And I'm going to play it for you two ways. One is, what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to try and emulate the Baroque style, okay, with my modern instrument. And the other way is I'm going to play it in a modern style with lots of vibrato, heavier bow. Let me just outline one other thing, and that is, we're talking about the bow again. In the Baroque period, it was very common to use a very fast and light bow to generate the sound. So for example, my first chord is this. So very light in the bow, and you see how quickly the bow traveled across the strings, right? Modern times, and I'm vibrating. Okay? So here's a movement from Bach's Suite No. 1 in G major. It's called Sarabande. This is the Baroque style. There you go.
Thank you.
Now I'm going to compare that with a modern style of playing, which was becoming much more popular during the time of Mozart, and especially during Beethoven. And then once we went into the Romantic period, composers such as Schubert and Schumann and Brahms, this is the style that we still play in to this day. stylistically much more different, wasn't it? You can hear a huge difference with the vibrato, adding the vibrato. And I think another really huge difference is the sustaining of the notes. For example, even if you just take those first chords, Baroque style, they're broken, right? It's more arpeggiated, like a harp would be. And there's spaces in between each note. And then the modern, you hear the full chord. And we sustain. Etc. So
Melodious, would you say?
Less space in between.
Yeah.
Continues the melody.
Absolutely. So that was just my little blip on Baroque performance practice.
Fascinating.
I think it's very, it's a really fascinating subject. I studied it quite a bit when I was doing my master's degree. And since this was our Baroque concert, I figured I'd share it with you. Matthew's going to lead us through, I think, a little bit more detail of music in the Baroque.
One thing I
Questions?
was
Yeah.
wondering,
Mm-hmm.
you were mentioning the metal strings.
Yeah.
A lot of the, let's say, violin virtuosos, what do they use?
Metal. Metal.
Even on Stradivari.
Oh, yes. Part of the reason why we changed to metal strings, it started right around the First World War. And everyone up until that point, until very much the late 1800s, and then it became in style after the war, they were all using gut strings. So part of that reason was because the materials involved in making the gut strings, this is what I read, were not as available during the war. Now, I kind of was like, really? Like, how hard is it to find sheep or cow gut, you know, whether there's a war or not? People are still eating sheep and cows. But regardless, that's one of the reasons. And so that's when those practices were starting to be adopted. Now, they stuck. The reason that we stuck with it was because at this stage of the game, if we look at the history of instrumentation in symphonies or concertos that were being written in the time of Mozart, we may have had 2 trumpets, a couple of French horns, most likely no trombones, no tuba, nothing like this. String sections were very small. Then as we progressed through, as composers became, or just, you know, then there's Beethoven and there's Schubert and Brahms, our instrumentation gets thicker. When we get to Mahler, we have 8 Wagner tubas sitting on stage. You know, we have 2 tubas in our brass section. We have 6 trumpets, 8 French horns. And because our strings that are metal are so much more resonant and louder than the gut strings, this is why it stuck, because all of a sudden, okay, now we can hear the strings again. Also for soloists, as a soloist playing with an orchestra, your job is to project your sound above the entire orchestra. So with a metal string on your instrument, you're going to have a much more likelihood of being able to do that.
How about the material on the bow?
What's that?
Any change in the material on the bow?
No, the material on the bow remained the same, however, just became longer and a little bit heavier as well. Yeah.
Kim, I had one question. It's not taking up time that you had for something else, but this music of the Baroque that's played today in small groups, like you'd go to hear a quartet or a quintet or something like that. And in the 70s in Chicago, they had a group called Music of the Baroque. And I believe, and you can tell me it couldn't be possible, that they use the Baroque instruments.
That is possible. And there are still groups out there today that are performing.
Are there today? Well,
Yeah.
I hope they're still going in Chicago, but it was wonderful because we went into Chicago from the suburbs,
Yeah.
and we went to churches. small churches all over the city of Chicago. They were invited to play in these different churches. Historically significant if possible. If not, it was just a church and they didn't have to pay anything for rent and could play there for us.
Yeah.
And they had these wonderful cushions, and I still have 2 of them. It says music of the Baroque because they were in churches with wooden pews and stuff, so we were well to have at least a couple of them. Well, I'm glad to hear you say that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
In fact, there are still college degrees in some music schools that are specifically Baroque music degrees. Yeah. So it's a very interesting performance practice that I'm very happy that it's still being, or just being performed, and that we're still keeping that tradition alive. Where, I would have preferred, actually, in my own opinion, our concert that we played, I would have preferred us playing in a more Baroque style than we actually did. But I think oftentimes many conductors make the decision to kind of just lighten it up a little bit, but don't completely change it, because most string players, at least out there, are not skilled, haven't really studied it so much, skilled in that Baroque style.
Do you want to
Yeah, or to be able to change it so abruptly. Yeah.
Do they make those instruments today too, do you think, for Baroque players?
Yeah.
Or do they just have to count
No.
on getting an old one?
You don't have to get one from 1650. So yes, absolutely. The instruments are still made too, but they're not, in your typical violin shop. You have to find a specialty shop for them. Yeah. Any more questions? Okay. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for having me back. I always have a lot of fun with these lectures, and I appreciate your patience with me. And unfortunately, I might have to ask for a little more of your patience than usual today, because I have sort of an unusual argument to make. I'm not going to deal very specifically with Handel or Vivaldi, the 2 composers from the Baroque concert. Instead, I'd like to talk a little bit more generally about what Baroque actually is, what that word really means, where it comes from, and why it's still relevant today. And to introduce that, I guess I thought the best way would be with a little bit of autobiography. When I was in graduate school, one of the first classes that I actually got to teach for was a very, very large lecture course on modernist poetry. It was big. There were about 150 students in there, and I was one of, I believe, 4 or 5 teaching assistants that were assigned to this class. And every week we would meet with the professor, the lecturer, to talk about what we were doing in our discussion sections with our little groups of students. And one of the other TAs, a girl named Erica, whom I looked up to a great deal, I always felt like she knew her way around modern poetry a lot better than I did, said that when she was introducing the class and trying to get to know her students' names and so forth, she did so by going around the circle of students and asking them each the same question. She asked them, how much do you love poetry on a scale of 1 to 10? And I remember when she said that, something really annoyed me about that question. It kind of got under my skin. There were actually 2 things that kind of bothered me. One was the idea of attaching a number to designate something that you love. It struck me as vulgar. It's like putting a price tag on it. Something about that kind of irritated me. But what really got to me was that I kept trying to answer the question for myself. Matthew, how much do you love poetry on a scale of 1 to 10? And I kept thinking, well, you're an English major. You're supposed to love poetry. You must be a 10, right? And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, no, that really isn't true, because actually most of the poetry I've read, I don't like. There's some poetry that I really, really adore. I love Paradise Lost and The Fairy Queen, or at least parts. And I love a lot of the poems of Shelley. But probably 99.999% of all the poetry I've come in contact with has left me completely indifferent, and I don't really care about it. So while I definitely love some poems a lot, enough to devote, a chunk of my career to them, poetry on the whole doesn't really do much for me. And it was the first time I kind of realized that you don't have to love something in order to do interesting things with it. I could still, deliver an interesting lecture on a poem that might actually leave me sort of indifferent. And that's what I'm hoping is going to happen today, because I have to begin with a confession. I don't like Baroque. I just don't. As a style, as an aesthetic ideal, the Baroque, I tend to find it almost annoying. And there are individual Baroque works of music and art and even architecture and literature that I do like, but I like them despite the Baroqueness of them. I have to sort of look past the Baroque qualities in order to appreciate something about them. And I'm not the first one to say this. There's sort of a long tradition of Baroque bashing in art history, music history, and literary criticism. My favorite writer, John Ruskin, probably the most prominent arts scholar of the 19th century, he hated the Baroque period. He thought that the whole thing was a terrible decline from the Renaissance. Jakob Burckhardt, one of the great Renaissance scholars of the 19th century, had a similar judgment. He thought that it was really a decadent period in art, sculpture, and music. And it wasn't really until the 20th century that the word Baroque began to kind of lose a little bit of that negative connotation. People began to actually like Baroque music again. And I would argue that it's actually, Baroque doesn't really designate a period of art so much as an aesthetic ideal that begins in a period, the period of the 17th century, and still really remains alive today. There are still artists, musicians, and writers that are working in modes that I think could be described as Baroque. And we'll look at a few examples of those a little bit later. But before we do that, I guess we should probably talk about what actually this little word means. What is Baroque? Now you attended the concert, so you at least have that experience to draw upon. I'm sure many of you have just from the comments that you just made, some of you probably have a lot of admiration for the Baroque period. But what does it actually mean when we describe a piece of music as sounding very Baroque? What are we saying about it?
Oh, you're looking for a response from us.
Yeah. Now that I've gotten you angry.
No, not at all. Don't feel that way at all. But if it needs to be absolutely melodious.
Melodious, okay.
It seems a little bit sad.
Sad?
Sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
I think sometimes but I never really, and it was all new to me when we went to these concerts, and I enjoyed it so much. For me to think about something about it that's negative, it doesn't come to mind so much, because I really did enjoy it.
I'm not going to try and convince anybody to start hating the Baroque, by the way.
No.
I'm not looking to recruit Baroque bashers, so that's not the aim here. But I'm sorry.
I like it better than kitsch, though.
Okay, good. I'll explain that a little bit about that term later on. Does anybody know where the word Baroque comes from?
No, I don't know.
No? It's a French word. It's actually the French version of a Portuguese expression, barocco, which means something kind of unusual. It means a misshapen pearl. You find a pearl sometimes is not perfectly round, but often very, very lovely nonetheless. And the Portuguese actually have a term for this, something that's lovely in substance, but awkward or freakish in shape or form. And the term seems to have come into common use sometime in the early 18th century. And like a lot of terms for art, it originated as a term of abuse. Originally, when people described something as Baroque, what they were saying is it's too weird, it's too fancy, it's too much grotesquerie going on there, it's too challenging. Yes.
Well, I think that would make a lot of sense, because if you're, at least in the musical art form, we're coming out of the Renaissance, where things were very, very simple and straightforward. So what you're saying makes sense.
Yes, and that's going to be, I think, really the defining feature of the Baroque. It's an ambition for more complexity, more difficulty, something that's more challenging than what's been done before. We'll look at some instances of that. But this idea of admiring something for its difficulty, it seems to me, originates specifically in this period, the early 17th century. It's, I think, related intimately to the foundations of what we know as the tradition of classical music. The Renaissance music, in some ways, is kind of external to the classical tradition proper. Renaissance music has never really had a very prominent place in the orchestral repertoire. Composers have occasionally looked back to Renaissance music as an inspiration, but it's never quite had that central position that so many of the Baroque composers have had. Composers like Vivaldi, Handel, Bach, the Scarlattis, quite a number of others. When we think of the major Renaissance composers, people like Raymond Lully or Josquin de Pré, a number of others, they seem to be more the target of a niche interest. It's never quite penetrated the mainstream of the classical tradition. I think it's worth talking about, though, exactly what this tradition consists in, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about what it is that constitutes classical music. I often find people talking about classical music as a genre. They'll compare it to genres like jazz or bebop or blues and so forth. And I think that, strictly speaking, classical music is not a genre. It's too big for that. There's too much going on in it. It contains numerous musical genres like opera or liturgical music, the Requiem Mass. Those are genres. But classical music is something larger. What it really refers to is a specific mode of musical production, a mode of musical production that originates with the Baroque. It's a mode in which there's a separation between the performer on the one hand and the composer or conductor on the other. The people that are actually making the sounds with their instruments are not the same people that are deciding what sounds ought to be made and how everything ought to sound. There's a division of labor between these two groups that constitute the kind of workforce of classical music. And it mirrors the division of labor of the modern capitalist corporation, which originates at exactly the same time. In fact, the first major modern corporation, the Dutch East India Company, was founded in 1602, right at the start of the Baroque period. So the modern organization of the Baroque orchestra and the standard business type organization of the corporation really come together. And again, they mirror one another. Just like the orchestra, the corporation is made up of a managerial class, shareholders who appoint a board of directors to oversee the business, whereas the workers, the ones that are actually making the commodities that are going to be exchanged, they don't really have a say in what gets produced or how business is done. So that division of labor kind of governs both the business world and the music world. And this gives rise then to, I think, an interesting set of conditions, because the performer is not the one who decides what's going to be played. That means that this other person, the composer or conductor, the one who is deciding what's going to be played and how it's going to sound, gets to set the standard. And there's a tendency that we see generation after generation for those composers and conductors to set that standard a little bit higher, just a little bit higher, so that virtuosity becomes more and more sophisticated. What it takes to be a professional musician gets more and more demanding with each succeeding generation. And there's a tendency to try and outdo what the previous generation did, to make music that's more and more difficult, more and more challenging, a kind of accelerationism that again mirrors the business world. The same thing happens in the world of capitalist exchange. There's a demand for constantly finding new markets to open up, finding new ways to increase profit, and so forth. And both of those impulses seem to kind of parallel one another in ways that I would like to explore. But let's look at some examples to kind of bear this out, if we could. This I've taken. This you can barely see that. Let me see if I can darken it. There we go. This is, I think, probably one of the more famous examples of Baroque architecture and pictorial art in the period. This is from the Viziskirche in Stadtgarten in Germany. This church was built construction began, I believe, in 1744, right about the time that Georg Friedrich Handel was attaining the height of his fame over in England. And it illustrates, I think, some of what we're already saying here about the ambitions of Baroque art. There's definitely a kind of ambition to outdo what was done. We see elements of, the great Renaissance achievements in art and architecture there, but everything is so much more ornate. How would you respond to something like this? What's Baroque about this church?
A little over the top.
Over the top?
It's fancy.
Yeah, very fancy. I mean, the detail is just overwhelming.
Well, it's such a contrast to what we do now.
Yeah. It's definitely doesn't look modern. It doesn't look like anything that would have been constructed in the 20th or even the 19th century.
So much of it was destroyed during the war.
Yeah, and this is one of the ones that luckily survived. I find, for me, I can appreciate the technical mastery that it took to achieve a work like this. The skill involved is very deeply impressive, and yet I find that it kind of leaves me cold. There's something that looks almost messy about it. It's like the detail just sort of assaults you in a way, and it looks kind of uncomfortable, like there's just too much to appreciate. It's being sort of displayed in an ostentatious way that almost says to you, there's no way you're ever going to understand everything that you're seeing. There's too much here to be fully appreciated, or at least that's what I kind of feel when I view a work like this. And I think that response, at least for me anyway, is characteristic of how Baroque makes many people respond. I'm sorry?
I don't agree with that many people would look at that for the first time and feel that it was messy.
Okay.
I don't think that would be their first, if you'll excuse my comment.
No, of course.
No, I agree.
But if I look at it and I just look at the workmanship and the people who produced that.
Yes.
And whoever, they didn't do it on their own, they were following a pattern about whoever, the artists or whoever was doing it, and that'd be my first impression. And I'm sure there was some that was far greater and more pleasing than others.
Yes.
I think it's unfocused.
Unfocused.
It's so overwhelming that it's unfocused.
Well, it's busy.
Yes,
sure.
yes. I mean, it's we could say a lot of the same stuff about medieval architecture. The Gothic church has a similar level of ornateness. And you mentioned the individual workman. And actually, this is one of the things that Ruskin talks about in his writings on architecture. His wonderful book, The Stones of Venice, has a beautiful discussion of Gothic architecture in which he celebrates the individuality of the workmanship that you can see in so many Gothic churches. The individual ornaments that you see hung all over. There's a great deal of personality that the individual workman was able to inject. And part of what made that possible was that those projects lasted centuries. It could easily take 200 years to build a Gothic cathedral. So that was far too long for any single person to really mastermind the project. It had to be a collective work. So basically every individual workman could leave some signature of their own on the project. Whereas the Viziskirche was built in only a decade, and it was overseen by one individual architect, Dominicus, I've forgotten his last name offhand. And this is a very, almost everything about it was specifically commissioned by him. He wasn't the only person to work on it, but everything was done according to his plan. So when we do look down at the individual details, we see a great deal less diversity. We see more the reflection of a single ego, a single architectural design, and every individual workman simply conforming to that pattern. And that's something that, for me, I guess is a little bit of a problem. I don't know that it needs to be a problem for everybody. In making some of these claims, I'm drawing heavily upon the work of a philosopher that I admire, a French philosopher named Gilles Deleuze, who was active particularly in the 60s and 70s, and who in the 90s actually published a book on the Baroque. It's called The Fold, on Leibniz and the Baroque. Leibniz is a major 17th century philosopher. And his argument is that the Baroque sensibility stems from a particular philosophical reorientation that occurs during this period. And he characterizes that in terms of this image of the fold, which I'll try to explain. This is probably the most famous example of Baroque sculpture. This is Bernini's sculpture of Saint Teresa, the ecstasy of Saint Teresa. And you can see she's in the midst of one of her famous mystical visions. This has been a very, very popular work of art. People come from around the world to view it in the flesh. But it's also been a very, very controversial one for a number of reasons. One of them is the eroticism of it. You'll notice that her vision is apparently being presided over not simply by a standard angel, but by a figure that is wielding an arrow. This is the god Cupid, or Eros in the Greek, from which we get the word erotic. And there's likewise a very, very strong sort of erotic imagery in the figure of Saint Teresa herself. Just the expression on her face, the way she seems to be in this attitude of complete bodily surrender, has suggested to some that Bernini is depicting Saint Teresa in the midst of something like an orgasm. And many people have felt that this is just completely inappropriate for the depiction of a saint. It's supposed to be a holy picture, and he's defiled it by mixing those two registers. But also, has been very much admired for the detail that he gives us in specifically the cloak that Saint Teresa is enveloped in. And it's almost as though, you'll notice that her body really only appears in the form of her hand and her face. And the cloak seems almost to be kind of engulfing her, drawing her back into a kind of formless chaos, swallowing her individuality. Deleuze would suggest that what this is doing is giving us a picture of the Baroque sensibility itself. That from the Baroque perspective, the universe is basically a single thing, a single object, one giant machine-like fabric. And every individual object within it, every person, place, thing, or idea that has a place in the universe is not really an independent object, but rather a part of that machine. It assumes a kind of provisional independence, he argues, by means of the fold. The fold is the mechanism, he argues, that individuates a particular object. And we can think of this in terms of the fold in a piece of paper. If this piece of paper represents the entire universe, Deleuze would argue, from the Baroque perspective, individual objects in that universe are constituted as folds in that single fabric. So the paper, all by itself, the sort of paper in two dimensions, we can think of as simply a pure surface. It's got a front, it's got a back, but there's nothing of it that seems to be off limits to us. It has a height and it has a width, but it doesn't really have any depth. It's nothing but surface. But when we fold it, something happens to it. We haven't really added anything to the piece of paper. There's no more paper there than there was before, but now it has a new feature. It has an inside. There's a part of it that we can't access. There's a part of it that is imperceptible to us unless we undo the fold, unless we turn it back in to a two-dimensional object. Deleuze argues that this sort of picture encapsulates what it means to be any particular object at all. To be an object is to be a fold in the single plane, the undifferentiated plane of universal being. It is to have an inwardness that is withdrawn that can never be perceived directly. The Baroque aesthetic ideal, I think, involves creating these folds artificially. And again, we'll get an even more vivid example of this in another of Bernini's sculptures. This is his, where did my cursor go? This is his portrait of Louis XIV. Notice how many folds we have here. It seems to be composed of almost nothing but folds, really. Everything emerges out of this fabric by means of these folds that suggest a deeper structure than is perceptible just on the surface. And Deleuze argues that this is really what the Baroque is all about. It's about suggesting a deeper structure that can't actually be seen or heard or read directly. And it's this aspect that I believe makes the Baroque an enduring ideal, an ideal that's still relevant to us. To give you one more example, one of my favorite examples. One of the most famous paintings by one of the oddest artists of the Baroque period. It's actually very early Baroque. This is Giuseppe Archambaldi's portrait of the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II. Some of you, I'm sure some of you have probably seen, if not this picture, then one of Archambaldi's other pictures. Almost all of his portraits look like this. He constructed these really vivid likenesses out of inanimate objects or non-human, plant objects, lots of, fruits and vegetables and things like that. And it exhibits that similar sort of ideal, where he's divorced the content from the form. So, for instance, if you look at the way Archambaldi has formed Rudolf II's nose, it appears to be composed from a pear, right? He's been able to, isolate a common form. His nose is somehow pear-shaped, and so he can use a pear to suggest the same form. It's as though the external surface of the pear has been folded over Rudolph's nose, just as the paper could get folded and suggest a deeper kinship between those two objects, a structure internal to them that binds them together and allows the pear to stand in for Rudolph's nose.
Well, this person, Rudolf, was he alive when this portrait was done?
Yes. He was actually a commissioned portrait, I believe.
And what happened when he presented it to them?
I'm not sure about that. And there's actually a lot of...
Yeah, I would too.
I need to know.
Yeah,
Did he sue?
Well, this is the problem. We aren't really sure. There's been a lot of debate about what the actual reaction was to Archambaldi's work. Some people feel that the entire thing was just a big stunt, that he was nothing but a caricaturist, that these were meant to be kind of whimsical joke-type portraits. They weren't meant to be taken seriously. But others feel that he was actually doing something quite serious. And there is an element that many people have located within his work, an element of morbidity, because you'll notice that almost every object that he's used to depict Rudolf II, they're all living things, right? They're all fruits, but they're fruits that have been plucked. We have ears of wheat, we have a pumpkin forming his chest down here, we've got an artichoke, and so forth. But in every case, you can see the broken stem. You can see that everything has been uprooted and everything has been removed. And many of these pieces of fruit, you can even see, are in the process of ripening and of decaying. And some have felt that his use of these objects to construct his portraits is actually suggesting a really powerful sense of the mortality of the subject of the portrait, that he's insinuating that Rudolf II is every bit as mortal and that his glory is every bit as ephemeral and destined to be destroyed as the piece of fruit. He's as corruptible as the material that he's made out of, which in the end is the same material we're all made out of, the same substance that binds all the objects in the universe together into this one unified plane of being. And this element of the morbid is another thing that many critics of the Baroque have located throughout this tradition. And to show that this element is far from over, here we have I think, a work of art that immediately, the first time I saw it, reminded me of the Archambault portraits. This is a sort of photographic installation by a contemporary artist, Tara Cilios, who has a very similar approach. Almost all of her work is composed out of the bodies of dead creatures. In this case, she's taken the corpses of two octopuses and sort of linked them together. But it clearly recalls the still life tradition that comes into prominence during the early Baroque period in art. And she's very self-consciously cultivated a sense of continuity with that tradition. So the Baroque is by no means restricted to the 17th and 18th centuries. It's a tradition that's very much alive, even though it's not quite as mainstream as it once was. To give even a more prominent example, a more notorious example, if you will, of contemporary Baroque, I've taken a short passage from James Joyce's most notorious novel, Finnegan's Wake. Have any of you ever read Finnegan's Wake by any chance?
I tried.
Yeah, good. A lot of us have tried. Very, very few of us have been. Can you tell us a little bit about Finnegan's Wake?
I barely remember it. I think it was a late teenager, and I just gave up.
Yeah. Joyce was the most celebrated prose stylist of his generation, at least in English. He became world famous in 1922 with the publication of his novel Ulysses, which is a very, very innovative novel. And after Ulysses, he began work on Finnegan's Wake, which he spent about 17 years on. Finnegan's Wake is a very, very long novel. It's about, 700 pages or so. And it's written in over 100 different languages at once. And the entire thing is a very, very elaborate dream allegory in which words are constantly being sort of bounced off of each other and sort of nested into one another. It's constructed out of a whole network of puns and portmanteau words and unusual linguistic hinge mechanisms, so that everything in it sustains numerous possible interpretations. Even at the level of individual sentences, parsing out what's going on is extraordinarily challenging. This passage occurs on the second page of the book, and I'm not even sure how to read all of it out loud. But is sut, were sewers. The oaks of Ald now lie in peat, yet elms leap where asks lay. Fall if you but will, rise you must, and none so soon either shall the farce for the nonce come to a set down secular finish. Trying to track everything that's going on just in those few sentences. I mean, you could write a book just trying to annotate what's going on there. But if we focus just on the final word, finish, it's the word finish, F-I-N-I-S-H. But the way that he spelled it completely undoes the sense of that word, because he's made it into a visual pun on the word phoenix, right? The phoenix is the mythical bird that dies and burns in ashes and is resurrected continually. So it's the bird that never finishes. The phoenix has always been a symbol of endlessness, of immortality, of the circularity of time. And Joyce, in using that image, in building that image into the word finish, is actually undoing the sense of finishedness. He's saying there really is no such thing as a finish. And this is how the book operates for 700 pages. So it requires enormous patience. It's only really ever been the preserve of a tiny little niche of academic specialists. Very, very few people have ever made it all the way through Finnegan's Wake. But what's interesting is that it probably will remain, one of the most famous novels of all time, even though very few people actually read it or even try to read it. It will remain influential by virtue of its very difficulty. That seems to be its primary aesthetic value. That in being so aggressively complex, in resisting any interpretation, it continually invites us to raise our own level of literary sophistication. But many people argue that that's actually a bad influence. That what it's doing, when a work of art invites the audience to try and act more sophisticated, it's doing something like what happens in the story of the Emperor's New Clothes. I'm sure most of you are familiar with that story, right? What happens in the story of the Emperor's New Clothes, the old Hans Christian Andersen tale? It's a story about
He's put down, actually.
Mhm.
He's not admired any longer.
Joyce?
No.
Or
In
the
end.
emperor. Yes. In the end, he's sort of discredited. What happens? The story concerns a king who is visited by two men who claim to be the greatest tailors on earth. They can make for him the most beautiful clothing ever offered to a monarch. And he's so excited about the prospect that he pays them up front. And he leaves them alone for a month to go to work making for him the most glorious robes that they possibly can. But they warn him up front that there's something even more special about their clothes. He says these clothes are so intensely beautiful that only the wisest can even see them. A fool won't even be able to see the robes. They are available only to those that have the utmost intellectual sophistication. So you will be able to use these robes to discern who in your court is a fool and who is a wise man. The king thinks, wonderful. They're not only beautiful, they're going to be intensely useful. So, at the end of the month, the tailors return to him and they present to him the robes that they've made. And what do they present?
Rags?
Nothing.
No.
Nothing at all. They say, here you go, king. Remember, these are the robes that can only be seen by a wise man. To a fool, they're invisible. So the king thinks, I don't see anything. What does that mean? I'm a fool. Well, I must be. I can't see anything. But I can't admit that out loud. I can't say in front of my court that I don't see anything there. So he says, oh my gosh, they're just the most glorious robes I've ever seen. I can't wait to try them on. And so they drape them on him, warning them, they're as light as air, your majesty, you won't feel a thing. And he parades around in front of his court. And all the courtiers take turns acknowledging, yes, majesty, they are the most beautiful garments any monarch has ever worn, even though none of them can see anything. And the king is actually just wandering around in his underwear. And so the king then stages a parade through the entire town, and every single citizen has the same dilemma. If I admit that I can't see anything, I'm going to expose my foolishness. I'll have to admit that I'm an idiot, right? And so every single citizen takes their turn just praising these glorious robes that aren't even there, until finally he gets to the end of the street, and there's one shrewd little 3-year-old girl who looks at him and says, what's the king doing in his underwear? And that just completely collapses the house of cards. At that point, everybody knows that the entire thing is a scam. What I'm claiming is that, at least for many people, what's going on in a work like Finnegan's Way, and what's going on in much of the work that could be characterized as Baroque, is something like what goes on in The Emperor's New Clothes. It's sophistication for sophistication's sake, and because we're all a little bit intellectually insecure, because we all are hesitant to admit when we can't understand a very complex artifact, there's a tendency to just sort of nod our heads and say, yes, it's beautiful, even if it leaves us a little bit cold. Now that might seem like a mean-spirited interpretation, and I don't want to be too aggressive about it, but it's something that's often bothered me about much of the work that is considered to be high Baroque. And this was, I think, crystallized for me particularly when I came across an article by another art scholar named Clement Greenberg. He was active particularly around the World War II period. He's one of the very first art scholars who championed the New York school of abstract expressionism, Jackson Pollock, Willem de Kooning, and other painters like that. And what Clement Greenberg has to say on the topic of kitsch, I think, pertains very interestingly to the way Baroque sensibility tends to work in the modern period. He's the one that actually popularized the use of the term kitsch, and this is sort of his definition of that term. He says, to fill the demand of the new market, a new commodity was devised. Ersatz culture, or substitute culture. Kitsch, destined for those who, insensible to the values of genuine culture, are hungry, nevertheless, for the diversion that only culture of some sort can provide. What he's arguing here is that a new kind of aesthetic sensibility results from the class structure. That what you get in popular art as certain aesthetic standards become dominant, is a desire of the people to imitate what they see as the legitimate or high or lofty forms of art. But since they're not educated, they're not formally trained in those forms, what we get are these kind of cargo cult type imitations. Imitations that can only really scratch the surface, but don't really penetrate that internal deep structure that binds the Baroque works together. And so kitsch is what you get when sort of low-class art tries to legitimate itself through imitating what it sees the upper class doing. He says that the precondition for kitsch, a condition without which kitsch would be impossible, is the availability close at hand of a fully matured cultural tradition, whose discoveries, acquisitions, and perfected self-consciousness kitsch can take advantage of for its own ends. It borrows from it devices, tricks, stratagems, rules of thumb, themes, converts them into a system, and discards the rest. So what you get with kitsch is a kind of hollowed out form of the elaborate, very, very difficult structure that the Baroque standard is trying to promote. And I want to give a couple of examples of this. One of my favorite examples of contemporary kitsch concerns something called the Janeites. This is a term of contempt that's come into circulation among literary critics. It concerns the novelist Jane Austen. I'm sure some of you are familiar with her novels. How many of you have read Jane Austen's works? Some, a little bit. There is, Jane Austen is, of course, one of the finest psychological novelists in the entire English tradition, a major writer of the early 19th century. But her popularity today seems to involve something other than her actual novels, than what she wrote. What we get all over the country, in fact, all over the English-speaking world, there are hundreds of these little Jane Austen clubs where particularly young women will get together, and it's kind of like a Jane Austen fan club. You know, they'll put on fancy ball gowns, they'll have tea parties, and so forth, and try to imitate the culture that they think Jane Austen was describing. Now, the strange thing about this is that if you actually read any of Jane Austen's novels, like Persuasion or Pride and Prejudice or Emma, Sense and Sensibility, you quickly discover that Austen is not particularly interested in ball gowns or tea parties or any of those other kind of vain artifacts of English high society. The only reason that she ever really talks about them is to illustrate how vain and trivial some of her more comedic characters can be. What Jane Austen is really interested in is psychology. She's interested in the vicissitudes of desire and self-awakening and self-consciousness and things like that. And so all of these kind of weird trappings, the tea cookies and so forth, that the Jane Austen clubs tend to endorse, they aren't really a part of Jane Austen's novels. They're a part, more than anything, of the Hollywood adaptations of Jane Austen. And in order to really take a prominent interest in that sort of stuff, you kind of have to ignore everything that's actually going on in the novels. This, to me, kind of illustrates kitsch. We have a passionate interest in Jane Austen that's absolutely hollow. It has no sense of what's going on in Jane Austen's actual novels. And instead, it creates this completely fake image of what constitutes the Jane Austen phenomenon and ends up worshiping it as a sort of straw man. An even better example is one that I'm going to show you here. If I can get out of... Oops, what did I do now? Hang on. Here we go. Okay. This is an example of what I would call very, very high Baroque kitsch. This is a musician named Inve Malmsteen. Have any of you ever heard of him before? He's from Sweden, as you can probably guess by the name Inve Malmsteen. It's sort of unmistakable. He's a guitarist. He became very, very famous in the early 80s when heavy metal began to become really popular in the mainstream. And he was particularly known for being able to play really, really fast. And that's basically all he did. Every performance of his was this absolute speed contest where he would just try to cram in as many notes as possible. And he began to cultivate this image of himself as being very, very heavily influenced by classical music, especially Baroque music. He was always talking about Bach and Handel and Vivaldi and so forth. And in 1998, he actually recorded his own composition, a full-length concerto for electric guitar and classical orchestra, and performed it with an orchestra in Japan. And I'm going to play for you just a short excerpt of that piece. It was recorded in 1998. And let me know what you think. Yeah, 1 minute of that sounds, that's plenty, I think. What did you think of Inve Malmsteen's concerto?
I liked it.
Liked it?
Yes.
Okay.
It was interesting.
Interesting, okay. It goes on like that for an hour and a half.
That may be too much.
That's a little too much.
Yeah. I feel like it becomes a little bit excessive. And I guess part of what interests me about it is that he's been trying to convince the world for years that he is a true classical musician.
Yeah.
And yet the style that he's playing in here seems to ignore pretty much everything that's happened in classical music for the last 200 years. He's definitely reaching back to a sort of Baroque sensibility. It has some of the sonic qualities that you would hear, say, in the darker moments of Handel's Messiah. And yet they seem kind of superficial, a little bit gimmicky. And you'll notice that what he's doing most of the time are these very, very rapid arpeggios. And if you're not an electric guitarist, you might not pick up on some of the tricks that he's using to try and make it sound really cool. One of the things that he's doing with his tone, he's playing through some sort of a delay pedal that creates an echo effect and has the effect of making it seem like there's more notes being played than actually are being played. Now, I'm a guitarist myself, and I definitely can't play like that. I couldn't begin to do what Inve Malmsteen is up to here. But I also wouldn't really want to, because it just doesn't sound interesting to me. It's technically very, very impressive. I mean, it must have taken him enormous discipline and years and years and years of practice to be able to make those sounds, and yet they seem to have nothing to recommend them except the fact that they are extremely difficult to make. That is, difficulty is really the point. It's nothing but complexity. And this, I would argue, is kind of what happens when the Baroque ideal declines into kitsch, when people that don't really have the training to be able to perceive the deep structure that informs the Baroque aesthetic ideal attempts to imitate its effects. It results in something that I would describe as kind of superficial, ultimately kind of noisy. We can stare at it with admiration because it's bigger, louder, faster, more dramatic than what was going on in the last generation, and yet it doesn't seem to have any real content apart from that. Now, I've been bad-mouthing Baroque now for a good 45 minutes, so I think I should probably give it a rest and perhaps give us a chance to rehabilitate. But I wanted to at least submit that for some thought, not to debunk the Baroque ideal. Indeed, I might be completely wrong about it for all I know. I might change my mind next week. But it's something that I think is at least worth considering. I think one should at least be allowed to dislike aesthetic standards that are often recommended to us as ideal. And so that's something that I wanted to just submit for thought. But I'll close with that and invite any responses, any comments,
Another question.
Yes.
When was this done? Is this very current?
This is about 20 years old. This was recorded in 1998.
Okay, 'cause I wondered when that swept through Sweden, Japan. You said this was.
Well, it was recorded in Japan. Malmsteen has fans all over the world. He's still performing, and actually, this kind of music is. There are a lot of musicians that are working within a similar idiom. In fact, Baroque music in general is very, very popular among heavy metal musicians. A lot of heavy metal guitarists really have a strong affinity for the music of Bach especially, but for the whole Baroque period in general.
I don't know a lot about guitar, but is it an easy task on guitar to play and perform very fast arpeggios, such as what he was doing?
I'm not very good at it.
I was just curious.
It depends on who you ask, and you know there's obviously some training that goes into it. He's studied something, but the fact that he seems to have ignored once again what classical music has been up to for the last 2 centuries suggests a rather superficial engagement with classical aesthetics. Or at least it does so to me. Again, I don't mean to.
So what he was doing was actually very similar to passages in some of the Bach partitas and sonatas, and the violin in particular, sonatas and partitas, where Bach will get into these very long, extensive passages of just going through these different chord progressions. The violinist, of course, is chord change, chord change, So it sounded to me very similar.
Yes.
It almost seemed like he was ripping it off, really.
Yeah, I would argue that that's basically what's going on. That there's certainly nothing harmonically innovative about what he's doing. And even there are even individual phrases that seem to be lifted from other people's compositions. I don't know if anybody's tried to bring them up on plagiarism charges, or even if that's a possibility. But the whole thing seems so imitative that it comes off as kind of fake Baroque in a way. It comes off as an illegitimate reproduction that to me feels tired. It seems like an aesthetic dead end. And I would much rather hear something far more transparent, something more something easier to listen to and easier to play that involved a kind of content, an actual musical statement, rather than just a repetition of conventional musical forms, which seems to me pretty much what's going on in the music of Inve Malmsteen. There's no genuine innovation. But again, that's just an impression. I can't argue that as a rigorous thesis. Any other thoughts before we adjourn?
Telemann was suggested in the bulletin that came on. You didn't mention anything about his music.
I didn't. I'm not really that familiar with Telemann. I know Kim knows some of his work, particularly because Telemann wrote I believe, a viola.
It's one of our only viola concertos from that period, because the viola was not a favorable instrument during that period. The violin was very favored, and cello in the string family was probably second in line. I've read that the viola and viola players during the Baroque period were generally servants or third-class citizens.
I see.
Yeah. So that's where my roots are. But I don't know too much about Telemann other than he wrote our viola concerto, and it's very simple. It's usually performed by, it's a student concerto generally, but that's not true of all Telemann's music.
I know that when they have something in England called the Three Choirs Festival. I don't know if you're familiar with it. But
I've heard of it.
three of the in in the Midlands, they have 3 choirs, and it goes. They do it every 4 years, and it's all a competition, and they take musicians from these 3 major cathedrals in that area, and they audition for it, and then they put on this performance for a week, and Telemans was some of their music that they played quite a bit.
Yeah.
And it also, this music was played in the cathedrals, and we went and stayed there for a week, and went to all their, all their programs, and everything. Was a real treat. Some friends of ours in England suggested we go, and they were going too, so we went with them. So it was quite easy to pick up on it all, and they had a wonderful program of it, and some of it was Baroque.
You said you went to the concert last week.
Yeah.
What was your impression of it?
Well, that last of, I like Vivaldi, but I like the Four Seasons. To me, I would say that particular, I forget the name of it now.
The Gloria.
The Gloria, yeah. Well, I thought it was very long, and I thought it was, when it said Vivaldi, and I didn't pay too much attention to the program, but I knew it wasn't the Four Seasons. So,
yeah.
But I just thought maybe this choir music, and it was choir and orchestra at these programs. It's fantastic. I've had so many good experiences with music, and coming here, where in a town of this size, and finding such a fine orchestra is really wonderful.
Yeah.
I thought the same thing when I moved back here. I thought, wow, Trevor Symphony has changed.
Yes.
I think I'll try and play in it.
Good for you. Well, I hope they can keep it up, but they've been there now for quite some time. I'm sure they will.
Yeah.
Nice place to live.
What is it that you lecture about? What is your? I mean, it's fascinating. Essentially, to me, when you discuss things, it's more a philosophy of the era, the music. Is there a subject matter that you particularly are coming from?
Well, my training, I guess my specialty when I was in school anyway, was in Renaissance literature, particularly the 17th century. So Milton, Shakespeare, Spencer, the metaphysical poets, and so forth. That's kind of what I spent most of my time, I guess, doing work on. And I've also been very much interested in Western philosophy for a long time. So everybody from Plato through Kant and Descartes and Hegel and so forth. And I still read a lot of that stuff. I haven't really lectured professionally in quite a while, but I still just kind of try to draw on as much of that as I
Because
can.
I've never had this perspective, which I enjoy greatly.
Well, thank you. I hope it's at least fun. I can't promise that I'm always telling the truth, but I hope it's at least provocative enough to be
You
amusing.
should see our bookshelves. Our living room is full of books. I will say that. And he always has his nose at about 25 of them at one time.
Have they ever considered, or are there any orchestras that incorporate guitar?
As a full-time
No.
spot, yeah.
Not
And
as
why not?
I don't really know the reasoning for that.
There's not a real large repertoire for guitar and orchestra, and it's mostly kind of smaller scale concerto type works. And one of the problems is that guitar is a really quiet instrument.
Yeah, I was about to bring that up.
Yeah. Even when Kim and I play together, when she's on violin and I'm on guitar, I usually will play through an amplifier because my guitar is just nowhere near as loud as her instrument. So when you try and put guitar into a whole orchestra or even a small, like a chamber ensemble, it's likely to get completely drowned out.
Yeah, there are a couple of pieces, I can't think of them off the top of my head, that incorporate guitar, but usually it's not as an orchestral part of the part that it's playing. It's, okay, here's the part for the guitar solo, and then we hear it and it's over and that person goes home and doesn't come back until 5 years later when the orchestra does that piece again. There's a couple of composers that were Spanish who, of course, written some guitar concertos. I just performed one up in with Great Lakes Chamber Orchestra a few months ago. It was a concerto for 4 guitars, so that was very, it was awesome. It was a guitar quartet that came up from Grand Rapids. Now, even then, we had to mic them. They had microphones, because they were all nylon string, and classical guitars have nylon strings on them, so very similar to what we were talking about in Baroque performance practice between the gut strings and the metal strings. We can't hear them unless they're mic'd, and I don't know if anybody, I guess only one person came to the concert, but we actually we had a microphone sticking into our harpsichord for that concert as well, because over all those singers, we have about 250 singers on stage for 2 of the pieces, and plus the orchestra. How is this little harpsichord going to be heard over that?
And that was not easy.
Oh, that harpsichord part?
No.
Oh, that was huge part. Huge.
Oh, yes, I know.
So difficult.
But
yeah,
it almost got drowned out in when the whole orchestra was full blast.
Yeah, even with the microphone sticking right in the middle of it.
So the microphone was right in that harpsichord. And that harpsichord had interested me. Is that the only one they've got?
I don't really know why they used that one. That's an interlocking harpsichord. I know the paint it looks like, they actually call it the Smurf. It's the color of a Smurf.
Yeah, I said to myself, what's that big blue box there?
Yeah.
And then, of course, I had it turned around the wrong way, too, and I was looking at the wrong end, because you couldn't see either end of it. You couldn't see the musician, and it just looked like a big blue box, and I thought, what's this?
Yeah.
Because usually a harpsichord is beautiful.
Right.
I mean, I've seen some that are really gorgeous, because it's
in fact, our
rehearsal.
Our rehearsal on Friday night was at First Congregational Church, and that church actually owns a harpsichord, and that was green, but it had all this very pretty paint on it, and then the stool itself looked like that was really cute. But yeah, that one was just, I think it was the box for that harpsichord was actually built by some students back in the 60s.
It looks like it. Isn't that terrible? But it really surprised me because it stuck out so. Well, doesn't the orchestra have their own harpsichord?
Oh no, TSO does not have a harpsichord. Yeah, so maybe someday they will. They're really very simple instruments.
From a kit.
Yeah. Yeah, you can build one from a kit easily.
Play the piano.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why not?
Looks like we've got another program.
There must be
starting
something
up,
else
so
going on in here, so we're going to wrap up.
Get out of your way, but thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.